Welcome to Global Creative Writing, exploring expressive styles from all continents. Today we'll talk about limericks from Ireland in Europe. We'll learn about their history, we'll learn about their form, and we'll write some limericks together. The limerick is probably the most well-known poem in the English language. It has evolved over hundreds of years into the poem we know and love today, with its refusal to take itself seriously. Here is a famous example by Edward Lear. There was a young lady whose nose was so long that it reached to her toes. So she hired an old lady whose conduct was steady to carry that wonderful nose. William Shakespeare, Alfred Lord Tennyson, Rudyard Kipling, Robert Louis Stevenson, and Mark Twain all experimented with the limerick. Limericks have so captured the public imagination that they've been the subject of many competitions in newspapers and magazines. Even today, writing limericks is still a competitive sport. Despite its long popularity, the limerick wasn't actually so called until the end of the 19th century. So how far back does the humble limerick verse go in history? In his book, The Curious Story of the Limerick, Matthew Porter tells that early versions dated back as far as the 13th century, but the more regular use of the form began in the late 16th century and was initially associated with beggars. A poem called Tom o' Bedlam, written in the style of a limerick, appeared around 1600. It documented Tom's madness, his need for charity, his escape into a fantasy world, and the fact that nobody should fear him. Again, this poem differed from the modern limerick. The first line didn't rhyme with the second and fifth lines. Plus, rather than poke fun at poor Tom, it showed sympathy and understanding for his plight. Here is the first stanza. Tom o' Bedlam. From the hag and hungry goblin that into rags would rend ye, the spirit that stands by the naked man in the book of moons defend ye, that of your 5 sound senses you never be forsaken, nor wander from yourselves with Tom abroad to beg your bacon. While I do sing, any food, any feeding, drink, or clothing, come dame or maid, be not afraid, poor Tom will injure nothing. So what about the limerick's use in Ireland? It has been suggested that soldiers returning from war in Europe during the 18th century brought the limerick to Ireland. We do know that the Mag poets, who hailed from the Mag River in Limerick, used the form. The 19th century saw the limerick reach peak popularity, thanks largely to the work of Edward Lear. An English artist and writer, Lear wrote children's poetry. The Owl and the Pussycat was one of his. He adopted the limerick as a form for writing nonsense verse, which became very popular during the Victorian era. How did the limerick get its name? This question remains a mystery. Does it really come from Limerick itself, the town in Western Ireland, or is it merely coincidence? The puzzle is complicated by the fact that the form is much older than the name. Even when Edward Lear published his Book of Nonsense, he didn't call his poems limericks, but nonsense verses. The earliest known use of the word limerick has recently been identified as 1889. Edward Lear has generally been charged with the invention of the 5-line stanza well known as the limerick, but he always pleads not guilty, saying the form was suggested to him. If we are not mistaken, it was taken from the popular song, All the Way Up to Limerick. Here's a well-known limerick by Edward Lear. There was an old person whose habits induced him to feed upon rabbits. When he'd eaten 18, he turned perfectly green, upon which he relinquished those habits. We may never solve the riddle of the limerick, but we can certainly continue to enjoy the people's poetry, as Matthew Potter calls it. He identifies its humor and sense of the absurd as its defining feature, enabling it to maintain its popularity and, importantly, allowing us to poke fun at modern society. Here's another fun example by Edward Lear. There was an old man in a tree who was horribly bored by a bee. When they said, "Does it buzz?" he replied, "Yes, it does. It's a regular brute of a bee." A limerick is a 5-line poem with a strict rhyme and rhythm. The rhyme scheme is A, A, B, B, A, and the rhythm is anapestic, having a da-da-dum feel to it. This gives the poem a bouncy feel that suits the light subject matter. There was an old person of Skye who'd waltz with a bluebottle fly. They'd buzz a sweet tune to the light of the moon and entranced all the people of Skye. Lines 1, 2, and 5 are anapestic trimeter, and lines 3 and 4 are anapestic dimeter. This means the first, second, and last lines have 3 stressed syllables, while the third and fourth have only 2. But with the 2 unstressed syllables for each stressed, the lines don't feel overly short. There was an old man with a beard who said, "It is just as I feared. 2 owls and a hen, 4 larks and a wren have all built their nests in my beard." There are 9 or 10 syllables in the longer lines and 5 or 6 in the shorter ones. There is some variance in the syllable count, as you can drop the first unstressed syllable of each line if you like. There was an old man in a barge whose nose was exceedingly large. But in fishing by night it supported a light, which helped that old man in a barge. Here is a collection of classic limericks by Edward Lear.
There was an old derry-down-derry who loved to see little folks merry. So he made them a book, and with laughter they shook at the fun of that derry-down-derry. There was an old man with a nose who said, "If you choose to suppose that my nose is too long, you are certainly wrong." That remarkable man with a nose. There was an old man on some rocks who shut up his wife in a box. When she said, "Let me out," he exclaimed, "without doubt you will pass all your life in that box." There was a young person of Smyrna whose grandmother threatened to burn her. But she seized on the cat and said, "Granny, burn that, you incongruous old woman of Smyrna." There was an old person of Rheims who was troubled with horrible dreams. So to keep him awake they fed him with cake, which amused that old person of Rheims. There was an old man on a hill who seldom, if ever, stood still. He ran up and down in his grandmother's gown, which adorned that old man on a hill. There was an old man of Leghorn, the smallest that ever was born, but quickly snapped up he was once by a puppy, who devoured that old man of Leghorn. There was an old person of Chile, whose conduct was painful and silly. He sat on the stairs, eating apples and pears, that imprudent old person of Chile. There was an old man in a pew, whose waistcoat was spotted with blue, but he tore it in pieces to give to his nieces, that cheerful old man in a pew. There was an old man with a gong, who bumped at it all the day long, but they called out, "Oh, lor, you're a horrid old bore!" So they smashed that old man with a gong. There was an old man of Kilkenny, who never had more than a penny. He spent all that money in onions and honey, that wayward old man of Kilkenny. There was an old man who said, "How shall I flee from this horrible cow? I will sit on this stile and continue to smile, which may soften the heart of that cow." There was an old man of Colombier who was thirsty and called out for some beer, but they brought it quite hot in a small copper pot, which disgusted that man of Colombier. There was a young lady of Troy whom several large flies did annoy. Some she killed with a thump, some she drowned at the pump, and some she took with her to Troy. There was an old man in a tree who was horribly bored by a bee. When they said, "Does it buzz?" he replied, "Yes, it does. It's a regular brute of a bee." There was a young lady of Hull who was chased by a virulent bull, but she seized on a spade and called out, "Who's afraid?" which distracted that virulent bull. There was an old lady of Chertsey who made a remarkable curtsy. She twirled round and round till she sank underground, which distressed all the people of Chertsey. There was an old person of Dutton whose head was as small as a button. So to make it look big he purchased a wig, and rapidly rushed about Dutton.
You can technically use the limerick form for any subject matter you like, but most often, limericks are silly, inane, and sometimes even profane. Here's another fun example. Tim wore rubber bands on his wrist for each item on his to-do list. But the more he forgot, the bigger it got. So now it's a big rubber fist.
Hello, how are you? I'm Nick, here to teach you a fun little trick. To have a good time when writing a rhyme, try writing your own limerick. There are limericks of all different kinds, so how do you write one that shines? You'll see that it's cool if you follow the rule. A limerick is made of 5 lines, so listen close to this song. Lines 1, 2, and 5 are all long, and in poems of this sort make lines 3 and 4 short, and I promise you'll never go wrong. You need to be sure and contrive to rhyme lines 1, 2, and 5. Then do it once more with lines 3 and 4, and your limerick surely will thrive. So let these pointers take hold, and if you'll write as you were told, at the rainbow's end you'll find there, my friend, your own limerick pot of gold.
Let's write some limericks together.